Okay, so have you ever bought something and then like immediately regretted it? You know that feeling?
Huh.
Like,
Yeah.
why did I just do that? Yeah, that's kind of what we're talking about today. It's all about emotional spending.
Yeah, it's really common. And I think a lot of people think about emotional spending as these like big purchases like a car or something.
Right.
But really, it's often just these little things that add up,
The little
like
thing.
that extra coffee every day or maybe that new gadget that you see online that you just got to have. You know what I mean?
It's like your brain is telling you you need this thing, even though you really don't.
Yeah, and marketers are really good at taking advantage of that. They know how to tap into our emotions and our desires.
So it's like they're playing with our brains.
In a way, yeah. They
Uh,
they use things like limited time offers or scarcity tactics to make us feel like we have to buy something right now.
It's almost like they're creating a sense of urgency so we don't think straight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where that emotional spending comes in. We're not thinking logically, we're just reacting to our emotions.
So before we get too deep into all of that, can we like define emotional spending a bit more? What exactly are we talking about here?
Sure. So emotional spending is basically any purchase that's driven by feelings rather than like a genuine need.
Okay.
So it's like using shopping as a way to cope with stress or sadness or boredom or even loneliness.
I see. So it's like when you have a really bad day at work and you decide to treat yourself to something nice to make yourself feel better.
Exactly. Or maybe you're feeling lonely and you start browsing online for things to buy to fill that void.
Right. It's like you're trying to buy happiness.
In a sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it can be really tempting to do that,
Yeah.
especially when you see all those ads and social media posts that are designed to make you feel like you need certain things to be happy or successful.
It's like everyone's trying to sell you something.
Yeah. And it can be hard to resist,
Yeah.
especially when you're feeling vulnerable or emotional.
So social media plays a big role in all of this.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you scroll through your feed and you see all these people with the latest fashion, the newest gadgets, the perfect homes, and it makes you feel like you need those things too.
It's like this constant pressure to keep up with the Joneses.
Exactly. And that can be really dangerous for our wallets and our mental health.
So it's not just about the money, it's about our well-being too.
Right. It's about recognizing that those things don't actually bring lasting happiness.
Yeah. And speaking of money, what's the real cost of emotional spending? I mean, obviously it can drain our bank accounts, but what are some of the other consequences?
Well, it's a huge contributor to credit card debt, actually.
Mm.
In 2023, credit card debt in the U.S. hit $1.13 trillion.
Wow, that's a lot of debt.
It is. And a lot of that is driven by those impulse purchases that we make when we're feeling emotional.
So like those little $5 lattes every day can really add up.
Exactly. Think about it. $5 a day, that's over $1,800 a year.
That's crazy. I never really thought about it like that.
Yeah, and that's just one small example. It all adds up.
So it's not just about the big purchases, it's about those small everyday expenses too.
Right. And it can have a big impact on our financial goals. If we're constantly spending money on things we don't need, it's harder to save for things that are important to us, like down payment on a house or retirement.
I see. So emotional spending can really hold us back.
It can.
Yeah.
And it can also take a toll on our emotional well-being.
How so?
Well, it often leads to a cycle of guilt and shame. We buy something to feel better, but then we end up feeling worse because we know we overspent.
It's like that buyer's remorse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that can make us feel anxious and stressed, which can then lead to more emotional spending. It's a vicious cycle.
It sounds like it. So how do we break free from this cycle? I'm starting to get a little worried about my own spending habits now.
Well, the good news is that there are things we can do to regain control. And it starts with becoming more aware of our spending patterns and triggers.
Okay, so what's the first step?
The first step is to start tracking your spending. And I don't just mean like looking at your bank statement. I mean really paying attention to what you're buying and why.
So like keeping a spending journal.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
Or you can use a budgeting app. There are a lot of great apps out there that can help you track your spending and identify your emotional spending triggers.
That sounds helpful because sometimes I feel like I'm not even aware of why I'm buying certain things.
Right. It's like we're on autopilot.
Yeah.
Sometimes we just buy things without even thinking about it.
Yeah, and then we end up with a bunch of stuff that we don't even need or use.
Exactly. So by tracking our spending, we can start to see those patterns, and then we can start to make changes.
Okay, so we've identified our triggers. Now what?
Well, once you know your triggers,
Mm,
you can start to develop strategies for dealing with them in a healthier way.
like what kind of strategies?
Well, one simple but effective strategy is to implement a cooling off period.
A cooling off period.
Yeah. So basically, before you buy anything non-essential, especially if it's a big purchase, Give yourself some time to think about it.
So like wait 24 hours before hitting that buy now button?
Exactly. During that time, you can ask yourself some questions. Like, do I really need this? Will it really make me happy? Or are we just trying to fill an emotional void?
I see. So it's about giving yourself time to really consider the purchase.
Right, because a lot of times that initial urge to buy will fade after a while.
And if it doesn't,
Then maybe it's something you really do want.
that makes sense. But what about those times when we're feeling really stressed or down? It's easy to say just wait it out, but in those moments it can feel impossible.
You're right. That's why it's important to have some alternative activities that you can do instead of shopping.
So like what kind of activities?
Well, it depends on what your triggers are. If stress is a trigger for you, maybe you could go for a run or listen to some music.
Okay.
If boredom is a trigger, maybe you could pick up a book or call a friend or do something creative.
So it's about finding healthy ways to cope with those emotions.
Exactly. And it's about retraining your brain to seek satisfaction in things other than shopping.
So we're talking about replacing retail therapy with activities that actually nourish our well-being.
Exactly.
This is all starting to make so much sense. But I can imagine that building new habits can be challenging.
It can be.
Do you have any tips for staying motivated and on track?
Yeah, accountability can be really helpful.
Accountability.
So share your goals with a trusted friend or family member, or even join a support group. There are lots of online communities where people are working on the same goals.
So it's like having a financial cheer squad.
Exactly. And it can make a big difference in staying motivated.
That's great. And speaking of motivation, I'm always inspired by real-life success stories. Do
Mhm.
you have any examples of people who have successfully broken free from emotional spending?
We do. We're going to talk about them more after the break.
This sounds good. I'm looking forward to hearing those stories.
Me too. They're really inspiring.
Stay with us. So we were talking about real-life success stories, people who have managed to kind of kick this emotional spending habit.
Yeah. Yeah, there are some really inspiring stories out there. People who have turned their finances around and, really found a better way to manage their money.
It gives you hope that, like, it's possible to change, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not easy, but it definitely can be done.
Okay, so let's dive into some of those stories.
All right, so one that comes to mind is Kate Flanders.
Kate Flanders.
Yeah, she wrote this book called The Year of Less,
Okay.
and she basically documented her journey of paying off $30,000 of debt in just 1 year.
$30,000. That's impressive.
It is. And she did it by challenging herself to a no-spend year.
A no-spend year. So she didn't buy anything for a whole year.
Well, not quite. There were some exceptions, obviously, like groceries and essential bills.
All right.
But she cut out all unnecessary spending, like clothes, dining out, entertainment, all of that.
Wow, that takes a lot of discipline.
It does. And it wasn't easy for her. She
Yeah.
talks about the struggle she faced and the temptation she had to
I
resist.
can imagine, but she did it.
She did. And she learned a lot about herself and her relationship with money in the process.
So what were some of her key takeaways?
Well, one of the biggest things she realized was that her spending was often tied to her emotions.
Okay.
She was using shopping as a way to cope with stress and anxiety and boredom.
Yeah, I think a lot of us can relate to that.
Absolutely. And so she had to find other ways to deal with those emotions, healthier ways that didn't involve spending money.
So it's not just about cutting back on spending, it's about addressing the underlying emotional issues.
Exactly. And that can be really challenging, but it's so important.
And it sounds like Kate Flanders was able to do that.
She was. And her story is really inspiring because it shows that it's possible to change even if you've been struggling with emotional spending for a long time.
Right. It's never too late to turn things around.
Exactly. Okay, so another inspiring story is about Kristen Bell.
Kristen Bell, the actress.
Yeah, the one and only.
I love her. What's her story?
Well, she came up with this really clever strategy to combat impulse purchases.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So whenever she feels the urge to buy something that's not absolutely essential, she writes it down on a list.
A list, okay.
And then she waits 30 days.
30 days. Wow, that's a long time.
It is. And that's the point. She's giving herself time to really think about whether she truly wants or needs that item.
That's smart. Because a lot of times that initial urge to buy fades after a while.
Exactly. And Kristen Bell found that 80% of the time after 30 days, she no longer wants the item.
80%. That's amazing.
It is. It just goes to show how powerful it can be to simply pause and give ourselves time to reflect before making a purchase.
So it's like hitting the pause button on that impulse.
Exactly. And it can save you a lot of money and regret in the long run.
These stories are so inspiring. They really show that change is possible.
Absolutely. And they highlight some really important strategies for overcoming emotional spending, like becoming aware of your triggers, finding healthy alternatives to shopping, and giving yourself time to think before you buy.
Yeah. Those are all great takeaways. And I think it's also important to remember that we don't have to do this alone.
Right. There's so many resources available to help us, like budgeting apps, financial coaches, and support groups.
And we can always reach out to friends and family for support, too.
Exactly. It's all about finding what works best for you and your individual needs.
This has been such an insightful conversation. I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too.
So we've talked about the problem of emotional spending. We've explored the psychology behind it, and we've discussed some practical strategies for overcoming it. But I think there's one more important piece to this puzzle.
Oh, what's that?
Redefining our relationship with money and what it means to be truly wealthy.
I love that. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, so like we were saying before the break, it's about kind of shifting our mindset away from just buying things and more towards, experiences and things that actually add value to our lives.
Right. Exactly. Like, when you look back on your life, are you going to be thinking about all the stuff you bought? Or are you going to be thinking about the memories you made, the people you spent time with, the things that you learned?
Yeah, it's like those are the things that really matter in the end.
Exactly. And I think sometimes we forget that, we get so caught up in the consumerism and the advertising that we lose sight of what's truly important.
It's like we're constantly being bombarded with messages that tell us we need to buy more stuff to be happy.
Yeah, and it's a lie.
Yeah.
Happiness doesn't come from things. It comes from experiences, from connections, from purpose.
I totally agree. And I think when we start to focus on those things, we naturally start to spend less money on stuff we don't need.
Right, because our priorities shift.
Hmm.
We're no longer trying to fill that void with material possessions.
Yeah, and it's not about depriving ourselves either. It's about being more intentional with our spending and making sure that our purchases align with our values
Exactly. It's about choosing quality over quantity.
and experiences over things.
Exactly. And it's funny because when we start to do that, we often find that we have more money left over for the things that really matter to us.
Yeah, it's like we're freeing up our finances to pursue our passions and our dreams.
Exactly. And that's what true wealth is all about. It's not about how much money you have in the bank. It's about how you're using that money to live a fulfilling life.
So it's about financial freedom.
Yeah. And financial freedom looks different for everyone.
Yeah.
It's not about being rich. It's about having enough money to live the life you want without stress or worry.
So it's about having choices.
Exactly. And it's about having control over your finances instead of letting your finances control you.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'd love to leave our listeners with a challenge.
Okay, I'm listening.
What's one small step they can take this week to break free from emotional spending and start building a healthier relationship with money?
That's a good question. I think a good starting point is to just become more aware of your spending habits. Like we talked about earlier, start tracking your spending and see where your money is going.
So like keep a spending journal or use a budgeting app.
Exactly. And then once you have a better understanding of your spending patterns, you can start to identify areas where you might be overspending or spending emotionally.
Okay, and then what?
And then you can start to make small changes, like maybe you decide to cut back on eating out, or you start bringing your lunch to work a few days a week, or maybe you unsubscribe from those tempting email lists that are always sending you sales and promotions.
Yeah, it's about those little things adding up.
Exactly. And it's important to be patient with yourself. Change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time and effort.
But it's worth it.
It is. It so is.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I've learned so much, and I hope our listeners have too.
Me too. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us today for this deep dive into emotional spending. We hope you found it helpful. And remember, you have the power to make choices that align with your values and your goals.
Absolutely. You're in control.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep striving to live your best life.